Hello, everybody, and welcome to my podcast, The Downfall of Holden. I am your host, Joe Rodriguez, and on this podcast, I'll be talking about Holden, particularly its involvement in the Australian Supercars and how it came to be a legend and, unfortunately now, relic of Australian history. Also today, I am bringing in a special guest, Andrew Exton, who experienced some of the glory days of Holden. Holden was an Australian car manufacturing company beginning as a saddlery manufacturer in South Australia in 1856. In 1908, it moved into the automotive world and later became a subsidiary of General Motors, which is a multinational automotive company owning many car companies. Holden very quickly became the manufacturer in Australia, alongside Ford's Australian-made cars. The Australian Supercars began in 1960 under the name Australian Touring Car Championship. From 1960 to 68, the winner of the championship decided by a single race. After 1968, the championship became a series as we see it today. Holden first won a Supercars race with Norm Beechey driving a HK Monaro GTS 327. Supercars would be the platform for the long ongoing Holden versus Ford debate. And from 1995 until 2012, the Supercars Championship's sole purpose was to satisfy the Ford versus Holden debate. Welcome, Andrew. You are a fan of Holden, and you experienced some of the greatest years of Holden in Supercars, particularly Peter Brock's reign as King of the Mountain.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for inviting me, because it is, I think it's a really interesting discussion. And just to provide you with a little bit of a context, Holden becoming a car manufacturer really came to prominence after the Second World War, which is interesting because it was really the time of Australian manufacturing, great Australian manufacturing, where we made lots of stuff ourselves. And that really came out of the war period where we had to be self-sufficient around the making of planes, trucks, machinery, machine guns, weaponry, all that sort of stuff. So Holden's rise as a car manufacturing company, significant enough that it was eventually taken over by General Motors, is pretty significant in Australian history from a manufacturing point of view. I'd probably say, Joe, you might disagree, but I probably reckon that I grew up at a time where car racing in Australia was probably at its strongest. I mean, everyone either had a Holden or a Ford, and I grew up with an orange hatchback Tirana as a family car, believe it or not. I think most probably the halcyon period of Australian touring cars was when the Holden Commodore became the mainstay of the Holden brand. And it was really then Commodore versus ideations of the Ford Falcon. Initially, you know, Alan Moffat and Colin Bond in those big Ford Falcons, they went 1-2 at Bathurst. I'm not sure what date it was, but really that was when Bathurst, I think, is still important in Australian history in terms of sport history. But back in the 70s and 80s, when there was Moffat and Bond and Richards and Brock, that was really the absolute huge period of Australian touring car racing as it became known.
Yeah, I think so. Completely agree with you, sir. I hear all these stories from my dad and my grandfather about how, you know, back in the day, like you said, the strongest time in Supercars history was when they used to take the cars out of the dealership, put some racing wheels on them maybe, and then just let them go on the track.
Yeah, and then you had that, and then the livery of the cars, the colouring of the cars became so ingrained. There are other people that drove factory Holdens, for instance, or the factory team, which became the Holden dealer team with the red, black, and white livery, was iconic in Australian sport. It wasn't just Australian motorsport. It was iconic. And then obviously Peter Brock in the 05 Commodore and all the versions of the 05 Commodore. There are other great drivers during that time, and many and many other, like, you know, as I said, Jim Richards, Colin Moffat and Bond, and then into Dick Johnson a little bit later on. That was an amazing time, and drivers were associated with cars. You were either a Ford driver or a Holden driver, and you never crossed over, and there was never any, and it was absolute rivalry. And I'm sure your dad and your grandfather's shown you videos of what Bathurst looked like when they used to go over the top of the mountain and down into Conrod Strait. You were either blue or you were red, one of the two, and you hated each other, and you genuinely did hate each other. It was quite amazing.
That's it. It's still a debate that goes on today between me and a couple mates that are passionate about it. And yeah, some of my favorite races to watch are throwback ones of Peter Brock coming around the mountain, King of the Mountain, as he was called. And just one of my favorites, I think, is from 75, I think, when he sets a qualifying lap. Sorry, no, it's a race where he puts slick tires on in the wet, and he's sliding about everywhere, and he still just seems to be quicker than everyone else.
And I think one of the things that people don't recognise today, Australia's always been a country where we've loved our motor vehicles, probably through necessity because of the distances we drive. And we've always had a smattering of different vehicles, you know, from overseas, whether it be Japanese cars, although I would say that the Japanese car really only came into Australia in the late 80s and early 90s. Up until then, families were either Ford families or Holden families, and what won at Bathurst, and this is actual fact, whichever car won at Bathurst, there was a direct correlation with the sales of that vehicle going forward, because, you know, that's how much Bathurst was seen as like a test of Australian technology and ingenuity, and also the reliability, which is probably the biggest thing that Australians have always wanted out of their motor vehicles, that sense of reliability. And you'd know better than me, but when Commodore came in, that really replaced Tirana as the mainstay vehicle, and Commodores were probably around, Jai, for 30 years, well, maybe not 30 years, but at least 20 years, Australian-made Commodores, that is, Australian-made and Australian-tested, not imported, not made overseas, but made in Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne themselves. The Commodore was just a car that really just took over Australia as a mainstay passenger vehicle.
Like if Holden was the manufacturer in Australia, Commodore was the car in Australia.
Correct.
I think what you just said about you know, sales directly correlating with who won at Bathurst that year, that's something that cannot be undermined, just the impact that supercars actually had on Australian car culture itself. And I think it's something that's so disappointing now, as you may know, that Holden is no longer even going to be in the supercars. It's going to be Ford versus Chevrolet as of next year. And you know, obviously that's due to when Holden began stopping manufacturing in Australia in 2013. And just recently, I think in 2018, completely GM just closed the curtain on Holden, and it's no longer going to make cars. And it's, you know, supercars, and like you said, it was an icon of Australia, and it directly correlated even with just what families purchased for their cars. And I think now that's something that's quite sad to see go.
There's no question, Jai. I mean, this is not an exaggeration to say you were a Holden family or you were a Ford family and you would never have considered buying anything from the other brand. I mean, I think they were great times, and I think they're great times because of the manufacturing prowess of Australian vehicles that were genuinely considered to be harder and tougher and more reliable than any other vehicles that were made anywhere else in the world. And they were, you know, we always talked about they were made for Australian conditions. They were made in Fisherman's Bend, and then the road testing of them took place down in Gippsland, where Holden had their testing facility. I think it couldn't be underestimated either, Jai, that they were associated with individuals too. Like there was that. I don't associate or have an interest in supercars now because there's not an identity associated with a brand. It's just drivers driving cars. Whereas even after Peter Brock, Mark Skaife then really took over the mantle as the face of the Holden dealer team and the factory team, and went on to win almost as many Bathursts. And at that period, it was Craig Lowndes who was driving a Ford versus, Mark Skaife that was driving a Holden. And also the technology from the square shape of the Tirana, of the first Commodores, Jai, to the sleek transitions, and almost the commentary that people had on the different versions of Commodores and Fords. And, when Ford went to that really sleek outline and no one liked it.
Yeah.
And no one liked it. Everyone hated it. Yeah. But Commodores, I think their design always pleased the eye, even from the square version through to the much rounded versions. The aerodynamics and the technology of cars you saw every couple of years as new models came out.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And it's unfortunately, without Holden involved in the supercars anymore, and no more, new designs. That was a part of it as well. Looking forward to what's Holden going to bring out this year, and how are they going to do the livery?
Correct.
How they're going to do the livery this time? And
changes led to controversy, and driver changes led to controversy. Mark Skaife and Jim Richards famously won a Bathurst in a Monaro, was it? Was it a Monaro? Or no, it was a big toy, a big Nissan muscle car in the middle. And remember when Jim Richards gets up and tells the fans you can all go and get stuffed because they were booing them because they won in a big Nissan muscle car.
Yeah, in a Japanese car. It was a Skyline, wasn't it?
And that's when Japanese cars were seen to be unreliable, tinny, crappy little things that no one would want to drive.
Yeah.
And then there was, I think things change, obviously, Jai, and that's progress is good in some ways. But I think I would struggle to be a fan of the supercars now because, number one, there's not a Holden, okay? Yep. There's not a Commodore, and I don't think even if there was a General Motors, a GMC vehicle going around that wasn't Commodore, wouldn't be something that I would be as interested in. And also, I don't think the drivers have the same connection with vehicles. They move like you've got, and they're more associated with racing conglomerates like Penske or Walkinshaw or those type of things than sort of the car, the vehicle. It's more associated with the team, than the motor vehicle. And we saw, didn't we, with Triple Eight Racing basically moving from Ford to Holden in 1 year, sort of thing, just deciding to change. And that brand loyalty and connection, I think, is lost and makes supercars nowhere near as great to watch as what it used to be.
Yeah, completely agree with you, sir. And unfortunately, it's something that my father and I, we're probably not going to watch as much as of next year. But anyway, thank you very much for joining me, Andrew. Unfortunately, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for Holden. At the end of this year, any Holden, there won't be any Holden vehicles seen on the Australian Supercars track, and they're not coming back, unfortunately. It's unfortunate that Australian car manufacturing is no longer, and that the car manufacturer of Australia has also gone the way of the dinosaur. But all we can do now is remember the legacy that Holden left behind.
Well, let's hope, Jai, because I have a Commodore sitting in my garage. It's done a few Ks, but I'm going to hold on to it. And let's hope that as you finish school, you get your hands on an old Commodore and you do it up, and I see you driving around the streets of Werribee in a Peter Brock livery Holden Commodore of some description, and you might even have the 05 on it, and we'll know who you are. Okay.
That's right. You can count on it, sir.
No worries. Good
Thanks
on you,
very
Jai.
much for joining me today.
No problems.
See ya, everybody.